Thank you for inviting UNOOSA, the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, to speak to you today, and greetings from the World Space Forum in Bonn, Germany, which unfortunately prevents me from being with you in person. For those of you who don't know UNOOSA, let me start with a brief introduction. We are a gateway between space technology, solutions and data on the one hand, and the needs of member states on the other. For example, we build vital capacity by helping member states access space data and imagery and training them on how to use it. But first and foremost, we are Secretariat to COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the historical seat of space governance. The primacy of COPUS for space governance was recognized recently in September at the highest level by heads of state when they agreed on the Pact for the Future, calling on COPUS to address topics of space traffic, space debris and space resources. So our attention now is focused on implementing the Pact, which we are doing by putting in place a comprehensive space sustainability program for COPUS delegates and member states. The topics being addressed at your event have never been as important as they are today. Whether we think of space traffic coordination, on-orbit servicing and space resources, all the way to assessing the impact of launches on the atmosphere and the impact of space activities on the astronomy community, there is a pressing need to address these many dimensions of space sustainability if we are to ensure safe and sustainable operations and protect space for future generations. The challenge is a big one, and an important part of addressing it lies in the ability of the international community and the space sector to take a coordinated and comprehensive approach to these various topics. So what is UNOOSA and COPUS doing to address them? We all know about the growing challenge of space debris and increasing collision risk. The assumption is that those launching the most objects into space are responsible for most of the junk. That's simply not true. Not yet, anyway. Most of the debris in space is the result of 60 years of launching space objects, and most of those were from governments. Making wrong assumptions about such important topics makes it very difficult for governments to discuss them, and it prevents progress. So UNOOSA is helping member states to better understand these topics because they need to deliver on their mandate to address them. Many of you will have heard huge numbers concerning the amount of debris in space. But despite that, when we as an office engage with on-orbit service companies, they tell us there is no market for ADR. That is an absurd situation that UNOOSA is trying to address head-on by engaging member states without obliging them to take commitments. We cannot expect the private sector to continue to invest in ADR solutions if they don't see an addressable market. With more and more objects in space, collision risk is increasing. Sharing relevant data and plans on space objects can help reduce that collision risk, and it's a central recommendation of the long-term sustainability guidelines B1, B2 and B3. Today, not all operators, public or private, are proactively sharing their data with systems like the Space Data Association or the EU SST system. This can improve if governments and regulators implement the guidelines. So we are working on this, firstly by supporting member states on how they can implement them. Secondly, by encouraging telecoms regulators to take a closer look at the guidelines and consider building the recommendations into their regulatory frameworks. And thirdly, by encouraging member states to bring representatives from their telecoms regulators to relevant COPUS meetings and side events to ensure that we break down silos and foster a common understanding of what needs to happen next. The long-term sustainability guidelines speak about data sharing of all sorts, and this can be confusing for delegates who don't have a space background. There's a lack of common understanding about what data sharing means, what type of information needs to be shared, with who, and what for. And fundamentally, this contributes to a lack of trust among key stakeholders around the whole concept of data sharing. Again, UNOOSA is putting a program into place to level the playing field in terms of knowledge and understanding of COPUS delegates, because how can we expect them to deliver on their General Assembly mandates on these technical and complex issues if they don't have a common comprehension about what they're all about? Some people suggest that the LTS guidelines lack teeth, that they're not enforceable, and that what we need is a new global treaty. The guidelines took as long as any treaty to negotiate, and they were adopted by consensus. They are the treaty of our times. But we need to go from paper to practice. That comes down in part to national implementation or even potential regional implementation if we consider, for example, a prospective European space law. But another important responsibility lies with COPUOS because it depends on effective and collective multilateral efforts. States will naturally continue to invest and develop and implement national capabilities in space situational awareness and space traffic coordination, but none of them can successfully become a global system that has the active participation of all relevant actors. Without multilateral cooperation, an effective, unified international mechanism to ensure safe space operations will never become a reality. This goes beyond issues of interoperability and different data formats. It is about trust between the parties. We can address this firstly by ensuring transparency, robustness of legal frameworks, and inclusivity in the development of solutions. But it also comes from the composition of the group that's doing the work. Of course, the private sector has an important role to play. But if we want a global mechanism for space traffic coordination where everyone actively participates, there is a lot to be said for a member state-driven process where all member states have equal weight, where consensus prevails, and where vested corporate interests are heard but are not allowed to unduly influence the process. Even if driven by operational imperatives, certain frameworks and mechanisms require good old-fashioned diplomacy to be successful. That does not mean that the private sector will not be involved. On the contrary, UNOOSA is already convening private actors in parallel, in less formal settings, to foster debate and discussion, and to synthesize their views and recommendations to inform the deliberations of member states. We're also ensuring that more presentations from industry are made to the committee under the various agenda items. We did this just last week in New York, where we convened operational experts from both industry and government with broad geographical representation as part of our first ever United Nations Space Bridge Dialogue on global space traffic coordination. There was considerable alignment on what needs to happen next in the views shared. We will continue this work in January by organising the UN Space Sustainability Days, involving a simulation exercise and a workshop for COPUOS delegates to help them appreciate that their work is neither a political nor an academic exercise. It truly matters to the future of space safety. It is our hope that member states will positively decide to host a space summit known as Unispace 4 in Vienna in 2027. These summits happen once every 25 years, and they allow us to elevate space once more to the highest levels of governments and serve as a great catalyst for driving progress in global governance and leveraging space for the Sustainable Development Goals. If agreed, Unispace 4 will coincide with the 60th anniversary of the Outer Space Treaty, which, although old, is most certainly not out of date, and it continues to be the cornerstone of space law, underpinning the entire space economy as we know it today. I hope that you found my thoughts and my insights helpful, and I hope that they will stimulate your discussions. Thank you so much for having had me with you.